And so, welcome to the brief lecture on stress physiology and reactivity. Let me begin by saying that you don't need to know all of this for the class. This is experiential learning. We're here to learn from our direct experience, not the intellectual side, but this may be useful to kind of put together what we're doing here. Remember, it's a mindfulness-based stress reduction class. So here is one way, and we all have a slightly different way of presenting the stress. There's many different ways that the MBSR teachers teach this. I tend to have that more neurophysiologic basis because of my background. And this is all things you can find online in textbooks and such. So it's not meant to be comprehensive or complete or the definitive word on stress reactivity. But to give you some ideas, especially if you're new to this kind of teaching on stress. So beginning by defining stress, was first brought into the so-called clinical scenario back in the 30s by Hans Selye, a doctor in Canada, who borrowed the term from engineering. Engineers will say the stress on a column before it breaks, or the stress on how much this can tolerate and not tolerate. So he brought it into his clinical practice, and he defined it as this non-specific response of the body to any demand for change. And the interesting part here is it's non-specific. He didn't say it was a bad thing or a good thing. He says the body's finding some kind of a change, some need to change, and it has this response called the stress response, as he called it. And by the way, he went around the world talking about this. And the word stress, actually, the word actual stress, the way it is, it took on the meaning in every language, in most languages anyways. You go out to the Japan, China, and such, and just say stress. Most people know what that word means. And then research was done 40s, 50s, 60s, and some high-end researchers, someone named Folkman, and then this Lazarus in the 80s, came up with this definition. As the definition started to include now more of a cognitive, a perception. So it's the perception of something that is appraised to be overcoming our resources and endangering and threatening our well-being. So it begins with the perception. So remember the 9 dots. As we perceive these things, we react to them. It's not the activity, that's not the stressor, if you will. It's how we perceive them. And so we bring in this, now we perceive something that is going to exceed our resources, and we trigger our stress response. And then Kelly McGonigal, I throw this one in because I found it very interesting. Her TED Talk and book is called The Upside of Stress. It began to remind us that stress does have a positive. The stress response is a biological adaptive response for our survival when we feel threatening or in danger. Because something we care about is at stake. So not only is it necessary and useful at times, it's triggered because something we care about is at stake. So it comes from a place of goodness, if you will, to protect ourselves or our loved ones, or something we own that we think is valuable. And therefore, I added in that last little thing in the pandemic. And so how stress is manifested, how it arises and such. There are 2 components. First, I'll talk about the stress hormones very quickly. Many people have heard of the stress hormones. They're listed here on the bottom of the slide, cortisol and adrenaline. Those are the 2 major stress hormones, and they're secreted by the adrenal glands. You can see the adrenal glands are down here. They're by the kidneys. So they're way down in the abdominal area, in the back of the abdomen. And what happens is we perceive a stress, whether we see it or hear it or feel it internally, externally, it triggers this part of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala, some people call the alarm center. It triggers the fight or flight response. But that amygdala shoots off a warning, it sends a signal to something called hypothalamus, then the pituitary gland, which is the master gland, which secretes the messenger to the adrenal glands to secrete adrenaline and cortisol. And I actually put this in not only to show you the stress hormones, but to show you how quickly this responds. We perceive something and we are into our stress response as a survival technique. We're in danger. All of this happens in an instant. Usually by the time the hormones are being secreted down here, before you start consciously aware of the situation you're in, how quickly this whole system goes. It's instantaneous, actually. And you all know what the adrenaline does, and some of you know what cortisol does, but just in general, I know it looks like a busy slide. It's not meant to be read and internalize everything you see here, but you know what these things do. They energize us so that we can react to the threat, usually to either protect ourselves by fighting or to run away, fight or flight as it's called. And so our heart rate goes up, our blood pressure goes up, we get blood sent to the brain and to the arms and legs and away from the belly. We mobilize blood sugar, we change our fat metabolism for energy sources. We alter our immune system and our clotting. So in case we are about to get injured, we're prepared for infection and so we don't bleed to death. Our breathing increases, the tension in the arms and legs. We reduce our saliva and our digestive juices so that we don't waste energy in digestion and things like that. So we kind of have an idea. We're energizing ourselves. So those are the stress hormones. The other part of our stress response is through what we call the autonomic nervous system. And this is the nervous system that is under subconscious control. It's what's happening right now in your body, running all of the organ system, digesting food if it's necessary, making urine, detoxifying, monitoring our electrolytes, our respiration so we have enough oxygen and not too much carbon dioxide, watching our blood pressure going up and down, our heart rate, and all of these things are happening without us having to think about them, thank God. If we had to concentrate on all that and figure all that out, we would have time for nothing else. We would die probably. But this is all being happening by this autonomic nervous system, and you can see it's the first part of the nervous system that's developed when we're in the utero. And again, monitoring everything, and it's the part of the nervous system that tells us how we are moment to moment, and that's how we know how we are. And it has two sections: a brake side, that's the parasympathetic, it's pausing, slowing down, and the accelerator side, the sympathetic, energizing. And not to worry about all the busyness here, it's pretty straightforward though. If you look to the right, the sympathetic or the gas pedal side does pretty much what the stress hormones do. The pupils dilate so we could see more, the heartbeat goes up, the respirations go up, the blood pressure goes up, digestion, saliva go down, mobilizing glucose for energy. And it's the system that is responsible when we're excited as well as when we're anxious, when we're in excited delight as well as when we're in fight or flight. So it's both on a positive and negative side. Then there's the parasympathetic, the left side of the screen here, the brake pedal. And it's mostly by slowing us down and calming us down. So we go into rest and digest. So it does the opposite. It slows the heart rate and the breathing, and it increases saliva and gastric juices and such so that we are sitting in, like it says, resting and digesting. We're allowed to repair the body if we've been out doing some work, restoring ourselves, and things like that. But work that was done back in the 90s on, it became the polyvagal theory, without getting too into that right now, but using the vagus nerve, which is the main nerve in this parasympathetic brake side. It starts in the brain, goes all the way down to the lower abdomen. The vagus nerve is divided into two sections: above the diaphragm, which is the evolved section that we see in mammals and primates, and below the diaphragm, which is seen in reptiles. It's seen in everybody, but reptiles don't have the evolved one. It was shown that the parasympathetic nervous system through the vagus nerve is the social engagement system. This is healthy. This is where we want to be at all times, whenever we can, to be engaged with each other. We are social creatures with social brain, and then resting and digesting. But when it comes to a threat, when we're threatened, it's also responsible for dropping us into what we call the freeze or collapse mode. It's really collapsing down, shutting down, playing possum in the animal kingdom. That is the a survival technique that possums have when they feel a threat and it's hopeless, they play dead. And some predators will leave them alone because they don't eat dead meat. And so this is how our autonomic nervous system really is active all the time. It keeps us going. It makes us keeps us healthy, and it keeps us in. We use this now in our window of tolerance. In this area, this part where we can be sometimes energized, sympathetic, into action, excited, or sometimes calming down, resting in the parasympathetic mode. So that we have this window where sometimes we have to be more energized, sometimes lower energy. We're flexible. We can be present, we can be connected, we're in the social engagement, resting when we need to, active, excited when we need to. And that's what the nervous system, this part of the nervous system does for us. So we want to be in this window of tolerance, which is a term we borrowed from, primarily from the trauma therapy people. So that's what the stress response is got to do with then when we feel a threat. So the autonomic nervous system keeps us regulated. We're in that window of tolerance, but then we have a threat. If we feel the threat can be overcome, we go into fight mode, which is the attack and protect mode, or flight, we run away or escape. So fight or flight, that's the sympathetic side, the stress hormones. But when we find that it's hopeless, when it's really a bad situation, and again, we see this more and more, we hear this from the trauma work, it's that sense of shutting down, collapsing, stepping back, really shutting down because a protective mechanism. It is an adaptive stress response to do that in certain situations. And then the social engagement system. This was work done in the 90s when they looked at the stress response initially, the work in the 40s, 50s, 60s that was done. The research was being done in male rats and then in male humans, which some people think are the same, but I won't go there. When they started doing the research in women, they found that the women tended to go into what's called tending and befriending. It was Dr. Taylor, I believe her name was, who did this work and found that women, imagine a mother with a colicky baby. What does she do? She picks up the baby, she hugs the baby, hold it close to the heart. That vagus nerve goes to the heart, the primary nerve to the heart, begins to use her mouth, goes to the throat, coos, sings lullabies, tries to calm with a soothing voice, goes to the facial muscles here so that you can smile, make happy faces and such, calming the other person down, comforting and bonding. So these are the adaptive stress response that we need for our survival. We wouldn't be here. So this is where stress is not considered a bad thing until it becomes chronic. And here is where most people land with stress. Stress, when we think of stress, we think of chronic stress. It's not really just stress. Acute stress is useful to get us out of dangerous situations when we feel threatened, but chronic stress does all of these things. And again, I'm not going over all this. You probably know this already. It affects all of our organ systems from our head down to our feet. And you all showed it in really nicely in that person that you drew on. But almost all chronic diseases are somewhat affected by stress, made worse by stress, and their treatment, trying to get out of the chronic whatever illness you might have, will be affected by the stress response that gets triggered. So just being aware that this is what can happen without getting into all the different areas, but just suffice it to say all of our organ system. And again, because of my background in neurology, the chronic stress response affects the brain in a particular way. It increases that amygdala, that alarm center gets hyperactive. We see that quite a bit in PTSD and anxiety and panic disorders. It actually gets bigger. So it's ready to go. It's always firing the fight or flight response. And stress, primarily due to the cortisol hormone, actually causes degeneration of the memory center. This is called the hippocampus. There's one on each side. These are the centers that degrade when people with Alzheimer's and dementia. So stress will also cause dysfunction and degeneration of that part of the brain. And what's called the prefrontal cortex, which is this part of the brain up front that is our higher executive functioning, the functioning like being rational, thinking things through, impulse control, creativity, planning, figuring things out, learning. So chronic stress causes us to be hyper vigilant, hyper ready to go, hyper aware, distracted, and reduces our memory and our rational thinking. And as it turns out, mindfulness does the exact opposite. It reduces that amygdala. Some people have shown it actually, the size of it reduces. And it increases hippocampus volume. We'll see more tissue in the memory center and activity in the prefrontal areas. So suffice it to say that mindfulness can be an antidote just on this level to stress. But the stress response, being as useful as it is, can become dysregulated. And this is where we see it most often. We mostly trigger our stress response these days, not because we're in a life-threatening situation like what it was meant for. We biologically adapted this from even our animal ancestors, but certainly the early humans many thousands of years ago were using it to really get out of danger in the Serengeti, when they were running around as cave people, all of that in small tribes. They really did go into fight or flight and freeze and things like that to survive. And without that response, we wouldn't be here. But nowadays we see it in little things like road rage, or somebody pushing your buttons at work, or hearing the news or social media triggering something. And so I've kind of made this up. So take this slide with a grain of salt, but it can be used as a model. The fight and flight, the fight being the attack or anger mode, from being just simply annoyed or frustrated to all the way to rage and fury. And we see the activity, especially when you're working with others. We use this model by a little bit when we work with teens, by the way. We see the behavior to be oppositional, argumentative, bullying, being aggressive, of course. So this would be a representation. Somebody is dysregulated in the fight mode. In the flight mode, it's the retreat, the anxiety, the dread, the terror, worry, panic. And what we see the behavior is people hiding away, avoiding, changing and deflecting, distracting from what's happening, so as to not be having to deal with what's happening. They're easily startled because the amygdala responds. And then the freeze mode really comes into play with the trauma work. This is the one we see when people go into that significant shame and loss and grief, which is becoming more and more of an issue during the pandemic, of course. It's the mode that a lot of people with depression and sadness, that sense of hopelessness, helplessness comes out. And the behavioral correlates are things like being numbed out, dissociation. This is the one for dissociation, spaced out, blank stare, the speech is disorganized, poor eye contact, person describes themselves as being frozen, not here, not present. And so being aware that this may be a dysregulated stress response. And then finally, in the tend and befriend response, it can be overactive. And this is what we see very commonly in my classes, in these MBSR classes all along, from day one many years ago. We go into what's called fixing mode. And fixing mode is that rescuing, enabling, wanting to help everybody else, people pleasing, and the caregiver burnout. So as a stress response, when we feel stressed out, we will sometimes, some of us will go into helping everybody else, but not attending to ourselves. So this is basically how it really pans out to be dysregulated, manifests more like this than actual physical or life-threatening danger that we may be in. And because chronic stress feels bad, we have these adaptive Fs we just went through that are useful for our survival. We get into what I call the maladaptive Fs. And again, be careful with the wording I use here, but the first couple that most people use will be drinking or eating, feeling bad, emotional eating, feeling bad. I may have a drink, or some people smoke pot, whatever it may be. I'm stressed out. I don't feel good. I have to do something to relieve the way I feel. So I'll start drinking. I'll start eating. I'll start having behaviors that are not always healthy. Too much shopping, spending money, going on social media, workaholism, that kind of thing. Some people throw a fit, start freaking out. Other people go the opposite, forgetting about it, as we say, avoiding, suppressing, denying, pushing it down. So expressing it, overexpressing it, or suppressing it. Suppressing it can be maladaptive. And we talked about the fixing. And just to be clear here at the end, I'm not saying that having a drink or eating is always inappropriate. It may be fitting. If you're had a long day at work and it's been 14 hours and you're really stressed out and you're really upset and you need to come home to deal with your spouse's birthday party or whatever may be going on, a happy occasion, pausing and having a drink or two or something else to calm you down, if that's what you feel is appropriate with awareness, feel free to do that. I'm not debating that. It's just that when these things are done over time, of course, they cause problems. With, you know, it could lead to alcoholism. It could lead to obesity and diabetes and all of that. And of course, the behaviors, too much shopping, too much work, all these things can even cause more stress. So the key here is, if you might imagine, is being aware of what you're doing and overdoing, knowing when there's time to set those limits and be careful. And so we use the window of tolerance one more time. We can know with our own direct experience when we're becoming hyper aroused, which is the fight or flight, angry, anxious, getting out of control mode. We want to be in the window, and we can be toward the edge of the window, but if we start crossing over here, getting dysregulated, we need to do something to come back down. Or hypo-aroused, when we start to zone out, when we start to isolate, when we start avoiding, numbing out, freezing, we want to come back into the window of tolerance. And as this shows, just for completion, stress, chronic stress, trauma, alcoholism, drug abuse, etc., will shrink the window. It makes it easier to come out of the window. Things like we're doing here, mindfulness, good therapy, walking in nature, spiritual work, eating right, getting good sleep will widen your windows, and that would be very healthy to do too.